Theodore Roosevelt, a man known for his rugged demeanor and love of the outdoors, once recounted a chilling story in his 1893 book, The Wilderness Hunter. This story, often referred to as the Bauman incident, tells of a mysterious and terrifying encounter deep in the wilderness. The tale begins with Roosevelt's introduction of a man named Bauman, whose experience would later be etched into the annals of cryptozoology as one of the earliest Bigfoot encounters. Roosevelt's The Wilderness Hunter is a comprehensive guide and reflection on hunting and the natural world, offering insights into the various species and terrains encountered by hunters in North America. It is within these pages that Roosevelt introduces Bauman's story, setting the stage for a gripping narrative that combines adventure, mystery, and horror. Roosevelt, an experienced hunter and naturalist himself, had a deep respect for the wilderness and those who braved its dangers. His recounting of Bauman's story is laced with a sense of authenticity, rooted in credibility he afforded to the seasoned trapper. The tale begins in the late 19th century, a time when vast stretches of the American West remained wild and largely unexplored. The American West of the late 1800s was a land of untamed beauty and peril. It was a time when the frontier spirit drove men to explore and conquer the unknown, pushing deeper into territories that were both magnificent and menacing. The wilderness was a place where only the hardy and resourceful could survive, a land teeming with dangers from both nature and the elements. Bauman, a seasoned trapper and hunter, was well acquainted with these dangers. He was a man who had spent much of his life in the wilderness, honing his skills and knowledge of the land. Bauman's story takes place in a remote mountain valley, a day's journey from the nearest settlement, surrounded by dense forest and towering peaks. It was a place where few dared to venture, and those who did were often tested by the unforgiving environment. Bauman and his trapper partner set out on their expectation with high hopes and the promise of rich rewards. They had heard rumors of a remote valley teeming with game, particularly beaver, whose pelts were highly prized. Their journey into the wilderness was arduous, involving a full day's travel through rugged terrain, but both men were experienced and prepared for the challenges ahead. As they made their way deeper into the forest, the landscape grew increasingly wild and untamed. The dense foliage and towering trees cast long shadows, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and foreboding. Despite the harsh conditions, Bauman and his companion were in high spirits, eager to reach their destination and begin their work. The two trappers arrived in the valley in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden glow over the landscape. They quickly set up camp near a stream, choosing a spot that offered both water and some level of protection from the elements. As experienced woodsmen, they knew the importance of establishing a secure base before nightfall. With their camp set up, they decided to spend the remaining daylight hours exploring the area and setting their traps. They worked diligently, placing their traps along the stream and in strategic locations where they expected to find beaver. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they returned to camp, satisfied with their progress. That evening, as they sat around their campfire, cooking their evening meal, an eerie sound pierced the quiet of the forest. It was a long, drawn-out cry, unlike anything they had ever heard before. The sound echoed through the trees, sending chills down their spines. Both men were experienced hunters and familiar with calls of various animals, but this was different, almost mournful in its tone. Bauman and his companion exchanged uneasy glances but tried to dismiss the sound as the call of some unknown animal. After all, they were in uncharted territory, and it was not uncommon to encounter unfamiliar wildlife. They finished their meal in relative silence, each man lost in their thoughts about the strange cry they heard. The following morning, Bauman and his companion awoke to find their camp in disarray. Their packs had been rummaged through, and several items were scattered around the campsite. Most disturbingly, The ground around their camp was marked with large, human-like footprints. The tracks were unlike any they had ever seen, larger than a man's foot and with an odd, elongated shape. Bauman and his partner examined the tracks closely, trying to determine what could have made them. As experienced trappers, they were well versed in the signs and tracks of various animals, but these prints defied explanation. They were too large to be human, and the shape was unlike any known animal in the region. Despite their unease, the men decided to continue with their trapping expedition. They had invested too much time and effort to turn back now, and they hoped that whatever had disturbed their camp would not return. They spent the day checking and resetting their traps, keeping a wary eye on their surroundings. For the next 2 days, the trappers followed a similar routine. Each day, they worked their traps and returned to camp in the evening, only to find their campsite once again disturbed and the strange footprints in abundance. The men grew increasingly uneasy. They were experienced woodsmen, accustomed to the challenges of the wilderness, but this was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Each night, the eerie cry they had heard on their first evening echoed through the forest, adding to their sense of dread. The men took turns keeping watch, their nerves frayed by the constant disturbances. They spoke little, each man lost in his thoughts and fears about what might be stalking them in the darkness. On the 3rd day, Bauman's partner decided to stay back and guard the camp while Bauman went to check their traps alone. The men hoped that by splitting up, they might be able to catch a glimpse of whatever was responsible for the disturbances. Bauman set out early in the morning, leaving his partner behind with instructions to keep a vigilant watch. Bauman spent the day working his traps, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the mysterious creature that had been haunting their camp. As the day wore on, a sense of unease settled over him. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. It was as if the very woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As dusk approached, Bauman began making his way back to camp. The setting sun cast long shadows through the tress, and the forest took on an eerie, otherworldly quality. Bauman quickened his pace, eager to return to the relative safety of the camp and his companion's company. When Bauman arrived at the campsite, he was met with a horrifying sight. The camp was in ruins, and his partner lay dead on the ground. The man's neck was broken, and there were deep fangs marks in his throat. The ground around the body was covered in the same strange footprints they had seen before. It was clear that whatever had been stalking them had finally made its move, with deadly consequences. Bauman was overcome with fear and grief. The sight of his dead partner, combined with the mysterious and violent nature of the attack, left him in a state of shock. He knew he had to leave the valley immediately if he wanted to survive. He quickly gathered what supplies he could carry, abandoning much of their gear in his haste. With darkness closing in, Bauman fled through the forest, driven by sheer terror. He navigated the rugged terrain with the skill and instinct of a seasoned woodsman, but his mind was consumed by thoughts of the creature that had killed his partner. He didn't stop to rest or look back, driven by the primal urge to escape the unseen horror that pursued him. Bauman's journey through the night was a harrowing ordeal. The forest seemed alive with shadows and sounds, each rustle of leaves a snap of a twig sending waves of fear through him. He pushed himself to the limit, fueled by adrenaline and desperate need to reach safety. After what felt like an eternity, Bauman finally emerged from the forest and reached the nearest settlement. He stumbled into the small frontier town, exhausted by and shaken by his ordeal. The townspeople, accustomed to the dangers of the wilderness, were shocked by his appearance and the story he recounted. Bauman told his story to anyone who would listen, describing the strange footprints, the eerie cries, and the brutal death of his partner. The townspeople listened with a mix of fear and fascination, their imagination ignited by the mysterious and terrifying events. Some dismissed the story as a figment of Bauman's imagination, the result of exhaustion and fear. Others believed that he had encountered some unknown creature, a remnant of the wilderness that defied explanation. And that, my friends, was the extremely terrifying story of Bauman's encounter with Bigfoot back in the 1800s, and it is one of the most fascinating, yet believable stories about Sasquatch that I have ever read. And I'd have to put it up there with the Ape Canyon story about the prospectors, who also had a violent encounter with Sasquatches. So, what do you guys think? Do you believe the story, or do you think it was just a story that Theodore Roosevelt told to help sell his book? Let me know in the comments down below. And thank you for watching.